Wednesday afternoon, looking at James, the immediate gospel, looking at what our lives will look like when we trust that Jesus is who he says he is, when we take and begin to apply our lives to live as he's called us to live as he lived himself, and to begin to wrestle with what that looks like on a daily basis. One of the titles I thought about for this lesson was Lost in Translation. Because I think a lot of what James says gets lost by Christian cliches, well-intentioned, that have started out over the years, that have morphed into words that are said that the original, those who originated from, probably explained in much greater detail, and now they're getting to us, whether it's decades later or centuries later or whatever it is. And, you know, we've condensed them to these little cliches that we don't even understand the meaning, or we don't seek to understand the meaning. And as I began to think of what my life looks like and who my life is in God, I asked myself this question of what would it be like to capture the wind? What does it look like to capture the wind? And so guys, girls, kids, students, parents, I'll give you a couple of silly observations. First of all, you could take a bag, you could run through a field, you know, holding the bag and filling the bag with air. You could tie the bag up. Air is now in the bag. And you might say that you've captured the wind. We know that's not true. I mean, there's no wind in there anymore. Now it's just what? It's just air. You could even maybe hold all the doors open, the windows open on one side of your house, and you could let the wind come in and then slam on the windows and the doors and say, oh, I've captured the wind. Well, what happens as soon as you slam the doors and slam the windows? The wind quits circulating in your house, and all you have is air, no wind. Or maybe if somebody told us they wanted to capture the wind, that instead of, you know, trying to think through the process of how they could do that or what they could do, you know, we sit back and we just condemn and criticize and mock and ridicule and say, you know, it just can't be done. It's the wind. You can't see it. You can't know anything about it. It just is. But I came up with 3 words as we look at this topic today. And it's my 3 words to you guys, you girls, you parents, wherever you are, and our relationship with God on a daily basis. And it's these three. The presence of God, the power of God, and the potential for God to move and work in circumstances. And I'm going to use a horrible drawing of a $1 pinwheel from Dollar Tree to make my illustration. You can take a pinwheel from Dollar Tree and plant it in your yard, and you have effectively, for all intents and purposes, captured the wind. Now think for just a minute. The pinwheel exposes the presence of the wind. The pinwheel also, to some degree, measures the power of the wind. Okay, slight turn, a little bit of power. Fast turn, more power. The pinwheel also can point us into the potential for the wind. In other words, the wind may be blowing from one direction one moment, and you see the pinwheel turn and twist on its axis to harness the power of the wind, to capture the power of the wind. And then a moment later, the wind is blowing from another direction, and the pinwheel moves again on its axis to point us that the wind is now moving from a different direction. And the potential of the wind is exposed to us. In our daily life choices, we have the option of choosing God's presence, God's power, and God's potential. And we do it by recognizing that the problems that we face originate with me. They originate with you. And I don't mean, for example, if you have a financial crisis, that problem may arise from you, may arise from mishandling of money. It may arise from the fact that you flat don't have a job. It may arise from the fact that the job you have isn't paying you enough. It may arise from the fact that you've been cheated in the past It may arise from a ton of other things. Maybe you're a kid and you're struggling in school, and you might be struggling in school because you haven't been studying, but you also might be struggling in school because your teacher can't teach the subject well. You might also be struggling in school because you may have a little bit of a learning curve in relation to how you understand certain facts, figures, and realities that teacher is not making a concession for. You may struggle athletically because you may not be as strong as others. You also may struggle athletically because you haven't been in the weight room. Okay? So understanding that our daily life choices direct us to see God's presence, God's power, experience God's power, and know God's potential in our circumstances. So one of the ways that we mess up in this is we say something like this. Well, God has just put me in a difficult time. And James addresses that because remember, he started out this passage by saying, listen, you need to rejoice in your trials and your difficulties. And he says that he starts out by saying, it's count it all joy. In other words, get your happy on. Then he says, and by the way, because you're going to experience all these trials and difficulties, you need to understand that you need to understand that you can ask God and He'll help you in those difficulties and our circumstances. And he says, and after you've asked God, you need to get humble. You need to really humble yourself, and you need to keep your focus on Christ and who He is in order to deal with those trials and difficulties. All right, that's how he starts out this passage. And now he's circling all the way back around and says, oh, by the way, let's talk about why these trials happen. So, trials and difficulties. James said, ask God for wisdom. We looked at that. James says, humble yourself and trust in Christ. We've looked at that. Now he says, let's talk about why they happen. So, let's you and I talk about why they happen. Verse 13 of James chapter 1 says this. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. Because God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that we should not say God is tempting me? Or what are some of the ways that we say God is tempting me? Because we do say that. And we might say it like this: God's just proving your faith. Remember as a kid, and I tell you, I say this a little hesitantly, but it is, in reflection, true in my life. I had a hard time believing in a merciful God because I was very much taught that there was a God out there just waiting on me to prove myself to Him. Whether that was fully intentional or not, that's the message that came across to me. And I didn't understand God's grace and the fact that God was a merciful God and was seeking me instead of me having to figure out how to get to Him and clean up my act so that He could know I was a good enough person to be saved, and pray hard enough and confess long enough and castrate myself or prostrate myself or whatever it might be to prove that I really wanted to know God. So we say things like, God's just proving your faith. We say things like, God won't give you more than you can handle. Now, those are two cliches, and I want to show you how they're wrong, but by changing the wording just a pinch, we can make them right. We can make them line up with what James is telling us here. So sometimes we say that God's just proving your faith. Well, here's the reality of it. No, for what James is telling us is this: God will work in us to help us prove our faith. Now, proving means, oh, you got to make sure it's real. That's the way I always understood it. James was saying it like this: no, God's going to work in you to prove or to establish, to create your faith. So God is working in you to create your faith. Your circumstances, your realities, your difficulties, your parents, your siblings, the surroundings you find yourself in, your job, your coworkers, all of those things are God working in you to create your faith. Not to check out whether you're truly a believer or not, but to help create your faith, to establish and build your faith. By the way, you can only build your faith in Christ in the circumstances you're in. You can't build it out of the circumstances you're in. That's a reality. Okay? Number two, God won't give you more than you can handle. James just said God doesn't tempt us. So how do we reconcile that? Well, we reconcile it by saying this: God does allow difficulties, but He promises to be present in the difficulties. So it's not a matter of God saying, well, Daniel can handle 3 trials. It's Wednesday. I give him 2 more. He can't handle them, but I'm just going to... He can handle them if he'll just step up. If he'll prove himself and step up, he'll be all right. No, here's the reality. God allows the difficulties in our life, but He allows them contingent upon the desire for us to seek Him. So where do these trials and where do these temptations come from? Where do they originate from? Well, in order to do that, I think we need to ask ourselves, what exactly are the trials and temptations? And normally when this is taught, it's taught sort of like this. Well, one of the temptations is for you as a teenager to live an absolutely immoral lifestyle, just go wild, behave and do whatever you want sexually, live a wild life, just go party, be a party animal. Okay? That's one of the things. Maybe you're an adult, and one of the trials we're told is to be, maybe you cheat people. Maybe one of the trials is to cheat people, make all the money you can make, harm others, etc., etc., etc. Those are true. I mean, the potential for those realities in our lives are true. But it's all about our daily life choices. And our choices stem from our attitudes and desires. See, our choices stem from our attitudes and desires. If you see me every now and then when I'm doing these lessons, I'm drinking coffee. Specifically iced coffee. That's literally all I drink. I drink that and some unsweetened tea and some water. But I drink coffee constantly. Constantly. I desire coffee. My attitude is get more coffee. Can I tell you something though? That was a choice. Years ago, Christy's big into coffee. She's been drinking coffee for a long time. She's enjoyed coffee and lattes and stuff. I couldn't stand the stuff. When I was 18, I think I was 18, I just kind of didn't act the wisest one night. And got to work the next day and was dragging and unable to really do my job. And I wasn't feeling well, And one of the guys I was working with said, just drink some coffee, you'll feel better, it'll help you. So I go in there and I pour a styrofoam cup of coffee and I sipped it and I was like, this stuff is disgusting. And he said, no, you got to fix it up. So he goes in there and he takes some powdered creamer. Now I don't know who you are and who's watching this. Don't do yourself like that. Don't use powdered creamer. Okay? Sorry. Soapbox. Pour some powdered creamer in my coffee, pour some sugar in my coffee, and he says, listen, you just got to drink the whole thing. I did. I went home. That finished me for the day. And for that time on, I struggled for years to like coffee and to get used to the taste of it. But I ultimately made a choice that I had to have caffeine, or I wanted caffeine, so I attitudes and desires got changed around. Well, here's the thing. You and I are daily making choices on what we want out of life. And that's driving our attitudes and our desires. And that is determining what tempts us. So here are 4 things that tempt us. To be right. Number 1 temptation for me right now, to be right. To be seen. Oh my goodness, do we not love to be seen? To have. To get. Wait a minute, time out. That's not a sin. Okay, well the word sin let me see where I got some space here. The word sin originates from the word, or from this idea of a target that is missed. Okay? So the arrow comes and hits here instead of hitting the target, okay? That's the target. There's the arrow. The arrow missed the target. That's where the word sin originates from. So James tells us that this happens. He says, look what happens here. Each person is tempted when they are drawn away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. So what he is saying is this, is that we have these desires, and these are some of the desires that I've noted that have been in my life, that are in my life, and more than likely there's some that are probably present in your life as well. We have a desire to be right. Quite honestly, that's why right now, specifically dealing with my culture, white religious people, we can't just shut up and listen to our black brothers and sisters when they tell us about the realities that they have experienced. And we want to get hung up on what we think is right. And such was wrong. And by the way, there are wrong things being done. But we are in such a rush to be right that we don't even listen to our brothers and sisters. And in so doing, we minimize their pain and we ignore their realities. Okay? We have a desire to be right. And that quickly turns in the desire to be seen. So not only do we have a desire to be right, we have a desire to be seen, which means we got to correct the ones who are wrong. Then we have a desire to have. You think about you guys, you girls, I mean, what do you want? What do you have to have? iPhone 6, iPhone 7, iPhone 8, iPhone, by the way, Mr. Chad had an iPhone 10 long before they came out. iPhone 11, whatever it is that you got to have it. And then here's the thing, you got to get more. You got to get more. You got to get new headphones. You got to get new whatever. I mean, the list never runs out. And by the way, if you think life gets easier as an adult, it doesn't. The list just gets more expensive. By the way, I am super proud of some of you guys and girls I'm watching that are 24, 25, 26, and you're moving out of that. You've learned it. You've seen it. And I see some of you guys choosing a little differently in your life, and it's so awesome. So what happens? How does wanting to be right lead to death? Well, it's really simple. You want to be right, so you get angry. You are right, so you divide others. You lead to division. Separate. This group is right, this group is wrong, this group is moral, this group is immoral. Bam, division happens. When you want to be right, you start disposing of others. They become disposable. It's those people. Oh my gosh, we are in 2020. If you are a white person and you still refer to African Americans, or even if you want to call them black people, as those people, you got a problem. Take my word for it. Kids, listen to me. If you refer to your parents as those people and don't realize that one day you are those people, you are the potential for that, you want to isolate yourself, you want to pull yourself over here and see yourself as your parents never experiencing the realities, man, your parents didn't grow up with cell phones. They didn't grow up with the internet. That's right. But they did grow up with peer pressure, and they did grow up with cliques, and they did grow up with pressure to do things. They grew up with the same pressures you grew up with. Hopefully they learn from that. Hopefully they're listening to you. I can't promise that, but I can tell you this. You can't think of them as those people. It leads to division. It leads to insults. And what happens when you dispose of others? You begin to die. The moment you don't value another person the way that God has created them and for the purpose that God has created them, you begin to die. Why? How is that possible? Well, because if I don't value the life of another, ultimately I don't even value my own life. I don't value the contributions I can make. I don't value the good that I do. I don't value the service that I do to others because I see it and this inner angst begins to just turn up within me. And I'm dying inside. How does wanting to be seen lead to death? How is that something that tempts us? Well, I thought about it like this. It leads us to self-promotion, making sure that it's always us that's seen, always us that's heard. Very much in the situation that in our lives where we can't just take it. We got to be heard. I think of so many times as a kid I did this. As an adult, I still struggle with it. I know my kids struggle with it. I know my kids, as in my youth group kids, struggle with it. Man, have you ever just listened to a teacher tell you something and walked away and said, I'll think about it? Or have you had to interrupt? Stop them so you can share your side. And by the way, your side is important, but sometimes we need to listen. What happens when we self-promote is we dismiss others and we ultimately condemn others. That leads to death. It leads to death. We're dying on the inside. To have, that leads to cheating others. That leads to hoarding. That leads to ignoring others because we have to have it. In order for us to have it, we are okay with other people doing without. So we're going to get all that we can get. And that leads to this, because once you want to have, you have to get. Okay? And so you move from like, I want to have an iPhone 10, I want to have an iPhone 9, it didn't exist, whatever it is, 11, 12's probably coming soon, or whatever it is. I want to have it, but once I have it, that means I'm okay. I want to see who else doesn't have it. I've always noticed in peer groups how a lot of times in a group you'll have 6 or 7 kids, maybe 8 kids, and you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that have the newest, and 1 or 2 without. And I've always thought that that group right there, that these 5 are not complete unless they know those 2 are without. It's really weird. But adults do that too. That we have this desire that I want it, and so, but I want it to the exclusion of others not having it. So we want to have it, which means hoarding it. And the moment we begin to hoard, we begin to die. Okay, because we're serving self. It's all about self. And that's what ultimately happens. Because here's what happens. Verse 15 says, when that happens, you're going to die. He says this, verse 15. He says, and after desire is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Consumption with self is where death lies. When you think only of yourself, your interests, your desires, your wishes. And so what James is saying is this, is fixation with these things right here leads to death. And he says all these things originate within us. And God doesn't send these trials and temptations on us. These are our trials and our temptations. So what do we do about it? Well, thankfully, James kind of sums up this passage right here by giving us a little blueprint. This is a little picture. He says, don't be deceived, brothers and sisters. In other words, he's like, this is an area where some of y'all are just really confused. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of firstfruits of all he created. Now, I think to understand that, you got to go all the way back to verse 5, where he says, or verse 3. He says, consider it all joy, brothers and sisters, when you fall into trials. And what I think James is saying is this: embrace your life. One of 4 kids? Embrace it. Only kid? Embrace it. Athletically gifted? Embrace it. Got to work 7 days a week to be athletic at all? Embrace it. Smart kid? Embrace it. You got to read you have to have the test in hand, open book, to score an 80? Embrace it. Can play a musical instrument? Embrace it. Clap off rhythm? Embrace it. And what I mean by that is not that you just say, oh, this is who I am, but that you, in each and every one of those circumstances, try to line yourself up with where God's presence is, what God's power is, and the potential that he has to work in our circumstances. So what does it mean? You got to embrace perseverance. The biggest way that we embrace the circumstances of our life is keep on. Get up and go at it another day. Show up again. You're a salesperson. Show up again. I hated sales. I'm awful at that sort of stuff. I mean, it was terrible. But part of the reason I was terrible at sales was I didn't keep on knocking on doors. I didn't persevere. Now, teaching and things I enjoy more, so it's easier for me to persevere. But you got to persevere. You got to show up again. Our lives are his first fruits. Not our financial situation, okay? But our treatment of others. Not our athletic ability or prowess, but our consideration of the needs of our community. We are literally living our lives for His glory in every way. James, the immediate gospel. The gospel that changes our life, that works in us each and every day. That's what God's called us to. Bless you. Notes are on Google Classroom if you want them. You need something, holler at me, and I will see you